Hello and welcome to this metacognition.org.uk staff CPD video on metacognitive strategies for discussion. So before I go any further, the warning that I give in each of these videos: if you haven't seen the Introduction to Metacognitive Theory CPD video yet, you need to go and watch that first. The reason for this is because the better you understand the theory behind what we're doing, the better you'll understand how the strategies work, the better you'll understand how we're supposed to implement them. If we're implementing them better and we're understanding what we're doing better, we're going to be more effective with them and students are going to benefit more. So you could go and use these strategies right away, but I'm very confident that if you have a better grasp of the theory and the underlying ideas behind it, you're going to be able to implement and utilize them a little bit better. So the aims of this CPD. The first one, obviously, is to understand why discussion is so important and why we need to develop it in our students. And secondly, we're looking to develop the amount of strategies that you have got to implement it within your classroom. So, discussion. Why is it important? Why do we need students to have metacognitive discussion? Well, modelling is great. Our modelling is fantastic, and questioning is great. It's a fantastic way of developing students' metacognition, but discussion is the best way we can develop their metacognitive abilities. The reason for this is student engagement. The ratio of student engagement is going to be far higher in discussion than it is in modelling and it is in questioning. In modelling, it's just us, and the students might or might not be concentrating. In questioning, you're probably going to have, again, only a few people who actually answer those questions. If discussion is working well, you're going to be able to get most, if not all, of the students involved in that, thinking metacognitively and thinking deeper. The other thing is, the more metacognitive discussion we have with students, the more natural it becomes, the more normal it becomes, and then this invisible thing becomes a lot more visible, and it's natural for it to be visible and discussed about. If it becomes second nature within the classroom, hopefully it will start to influence students' ways of discussing outside the classroom as well. It'll be something that they utilise when they're revising with friends or with family members. It'll be just something that becomes second nature to their practice more generally. So strategies, there are a whole load of strategies available for this one, 17 in total. Again, no one size fits all. You've got to pick the strategies that you know will suit your classes, that you know will suit your subject and the content. So strategy one is these question cards. So these are the same questioning cards that were mentioned during the questioning CPD video. The idea behind these is these questioning cards support students go through the stages that they need to have successful problem-solving abilities, to be able to successfully complete a task or to complete a problem. These questioning cards come in the comprehension, connection, strategies, and evaluation formats, and they guide students through these different areas and ask them the questions that they need to be able to answer to be successful. Students are going to need to be trained to use these cards. They act as a scaffold, so obviously over time we want to be able to remove these questioning cards so that students can do it independently without support, but we are going to need to train them on how to use them, and we're only going to be able to remove them if we're using them frequently enough. I would recommend printing out these questioning cards, getting them laminated, cutting them up so you're not having to do it all the time. It's just something you've got on your desk and you can just throw out to the groups very quickly. Once students have started to ask these questions, when they start to elaborate on their answers and when they start to provide their justifications when they're answering those why questions, you'll find that students' discussion starts to develop. If students are struggling to develop their discussion, they can just go back to the questioning cards and ask another question to their partner or to the group more generally. But here we're trying to get students to develop that conversation, develop that discussion, and bring these questions naturally in to what they're discussing about a task or a strategy. The other beneficial thing here is students will hopefully become more independent. If they're learning these questions, they're going to hopefully start to ask them automatically, even if we're not there, even if they're not in lesson, they'll hopefully just start to ask these questions of themselves more generally. So these are the examples up here. They're all available on the website underneath the questioning drop down on the teacher section. So please do go there. They're available in Word and PDF format in case you do want to edit them first. Otherwise, print them off and, like I say, get them laminated so you've got them available. There are 9 questions for each of the 4 different types. You might need to edit them because these are STEM specific, but I imagine that a lot of the questions would suit a lot of other subjects as well. I haven't said that they will because I'm a maths specialist, so I don't want to say that they're going to work for other subjects and then they don't. It'll be up to you to use your subject knowledge there. The second one is the questioning matrix. So again, this was mentioned during the questioning video, and the idea here is to utilize the questioning matrix to stimulate some level of discussion. So the questioning matrix is, of course, where you put a source or a photograph in the center of the matrix. Students then generate questions by using the y-axis and then the x-axis, and then again, much like the questioning cards, this will start to generate some level of discussion when students start to justify their answers, when they're answering these why questions, when they are explaining what they're thinking. Again, if students are struggling, they can just go back to the matrix and just ask another question to begin to re-stimulate their conversation. So again, here is the matrix as an example. You can see that students would take a keyword from the y-axis on the left, such as how, and then a keyword from the x-axis, such as might, and their question would be how might, and they'd use the source in the middle, and they'd begin to answer that question and to develop a conversation from it. 3 examples here for you to have a look at. History 1 here, Science 1 here, and a Food Tech Science PE 1 here. Again, as you'll see flashing up, these are available on the website as well under the Metacognition questioning drop-down in the teacher section, so please go and take a look. There are a huge range of examples there for all of the different subjects. These matrix do work for all different types of subjects, all ages and abilities. You will just need to pick an appropriate source for the center. Strategy 3 is the idea of quiz trade. So again, something that we've mentioned. I really enjoy this one. Students are both given a question card. So this could either be something on content or it could be on strategy use or a metacognitive question. I suggest here that maybe you could just use the questioning cards. Saves your workload, saves you having to develop something that is already out there. All that happens is students get into pairs. Student A will ask student B their question. Student B will then ask student A their question, they swap cards, and then they go and ask someone else. Very simple, but this way, in a group, obviously, students can just sort of sit there and get away with maybe not answering very much, but in these pairs where they're forced to keep asking questions and swap, then hopefully they're going to be answering more altogether. So strategy 4 is the idea of a misconception discussion. So here, you're wanting to provide students with either a Freya model or an answer with mistakes. So the idea here is that we are getting students to identify the mistakes or to write in the common misconceptions they find. So if you're not familiar with a Freya model, this is covered in the Planning and the Graphic Organizer, CPD. So a Freya model includes a section which highlights non-examples or common mistakes. So what we're wanting to do here is get students to lead a discussion, to ask each other, what are the mistakes? Why are they mistakes? How can we explain these mistakes, or how can we say that they're common mistakes? And really just generate a discussion about the concept that is incorrect. So you can see an example here, an algebra maths example, different substitution questions, and students here would need to evaluate the different answers, conclude on which one they thought was correct, and then debate it. They could then have a conversation about where the other mistakes had arisen from. The next strategy, strategy 5, is on good, better, and best answers. So good, better, and best answers does what it says on the tin. You provide students with exemplar answers, exam questions, essays, etc. A good answer, a slightly better answer, and then the highest quality answer. And what you're wanting students to do is to determine which is the best answer and why. The key point here, or the 2 key points, key point number 1 is that we're getting high quality answers. We don't want students just to say, oh, it uses more dates, so it's better. We need students to be justifying and explaining their answer so that it informs their future practice. So just by saying, oh, it includes more dates, that's not explaining why it's better. But if a student were to say, it includes more dates, which helps to justify their answer, this makes it a stronger argument, and so this answer is better. Students can then see that they need to include more dates. That supports their arguments, and a stronger argument leads to a better answer. So here students will be able to evaluate what makes a good answer. Again, here to lead on the discussion, we're looking for students to disagree and to maybe have a sort of a debate over what makes a better answer. Here, you also might find that students just straight away agree on what makes it a better answer, but you'd be looking for students to expand on the reasons why and maybe try to find more reasons why or how they could then use it in their own practice. Strategy 6 is talking heads. So it's very similar to the last two that we've looked at. Here it's about providing students with several different answers. Typically they're all correct answers, although you might throw in an incorrect one. I typically try to keep them as correct answers. And all you've got to do is get students to, again, debate which answer is best and why. So you're possibly not looking at such long questions like you would in a good, better, or best. It's possibly more suitable for the STEM, as the example shows here. And all you're doing is you're giving students different answers, and they've again got to discuss and debate which one is best and why. Strategy 7, graphic organisers. I'm not going to go into these in much detail here, purely because they're covered a little bit during the planning CPD, but also because there is an hour-long CPD on graphic organisers available on our website. Graphic organisers are one of the most beneficial metacognitive tools out there, so I really would urge you to try to find an hour to go through that CPD. The CPD on graphic organisers is under the planning section on the website, and it includes information on the 10 different types of graphic organiser, how we as teachers use them, how we can support students using them, why we would use them, and the outcomes of those activities, as well as common pitfalls and misconceptions from a teacher and student viewpoint. In terms of what we're looking at, though, in terms of discussion, you can get students to complete these graphic organisers, and then you can get students to debate and discuss the differences that they find. So maybe students have got different content on there, possibly students have got different examples, or maybe they've just not got as much detail and depth. So you'd really be looking for students to work together to justify what they've got on there. The other thing you can do is get students to add in a frame of reference to any graphic organiser, and a frame of reference is put around the outside, and students have to explain where they know this information from. So they've seen it on the TV, have you taught it to them, have they got it from an older brother or sister, that sort of thing. And again, students can begin to debate and discuss these factors as well. Like I've mentioned, go and watch that CPD for more. Now, the next one, strategy 8, is looking at exam question marking. So it's very similar to the good, better, and best answers, but here you're getting students to look in depth at how you mark an answer and specifically how or what the exam board are looking for. So again, we're looking to pick up key bits that are crucial to a high quality answer, but we're also trying to understand it from an exam point of view. So here we need to train students on how to mark their different questions, but once they're trained, we would give students a range of different questions, which we would then get them to mark. You then put students into groups and you see whether they agree. If they've got the same answers, if they've marked it the same, then they can all agree why they've marked it like that. And if they don't, typically people are going to disagree over marking, as we do as teachers, then students are going to have to justify their answers. They're going to have to explain why they've marked it in certain manners. You can also have slightly lower level reflection again in terms of what makes a higher quality answer, how have they got their marks on the paper, and other things like that. There's some example questions that students might use popping up on the screen now. Now, this is a very difficult strategy to use unless you have got a very hard-working and independent class. It will be very easy just to give students a load of handouts and them to easily spend 60 minutes just putting a few ticks on it and just discussing Love Island. So it's a very hard task to do, and you're going to need to train the students up well and provide strong, clear guidelines on what is expected. Possibly you could do this by having drop-ins every 10 minutes where you come back to the front and assess where everybody's up to. Or you say after 10 minutes, you expect everybody to agree on a mark, and you go around the different groups and see if they've agreed on a mark, that sort of thing. Just so you've got some scaffold and signposts there to make sure that students are keeping up with the task. Strategy 9 is strategy, justification, and evaluation. So the idea here is that students would have a look at a task, evaluate the task, and then decide what strategy they would choose to attempt it. Now, you might find that students agree, though you will often find that students approach things with different strategies. And here we'd be looking for students to work in pairs or groups and explain the different strengths and weaknesses of their strategy, which is incredibly important. If students are able to evaluate the difficulties and the strengths of their strategy, they're going to be able to utilize these strategies without scaffolding and support later, i.e. they're going to become more independent and metacognitive. The second thing is, if we're getting students to have some level of debate, they can start to see and weigh up the benefits, the pros and cons of different strategy use for the same task. You might even get students to pick the strategy and complete the task so that students can reflect on it in retrospect, once they've completed the task. So instead of getting students to just predict, they could predict which will be best. They could then complete the task, and they could then evaluate which one would be best. Strategy 10 is the idea of working backwards. So again, this was one that was mentioned during the modelling section CPD. And what we'd be giving here is we'd be giving students a question and we'd be giving them an answer. And we'd be saying to students, right, I want you to go from the answer back to the question. Sounds quite straightforward, but it's often not. Not only do you have to do the process in reverse, but we would be looking here for students to justify what they are doing. This justification is why questions and ensuring that we are going in the correct order or reverse order of steps for the strategy will lead to this level of discussion. We'd be needing group discussion, we'd be needing justifications from different students, and we'd be needing consensus so that they could all move forward from the answer back to the question. Strategy 11 is very similar. It is, what is the question? The idea here is that you just give the students some information and then you challenge them to think up what the question might be. It's a very good way for students to understand what might come up in an exam, and it's a very good way for you to assess what students actually know of the topic and actually assess how many different questions you have given them. Have you just given them the same type of question, or have you actually exposed them to a range of different questions? You can then get students to discuss whether each question they've developed actually works for the content, i.e., would that be a suitable question? Is it actually theoretically possible? You could then ask students which question is most likely and why, and then you can get students to evaluate how much or how many marks they would get for each of the different types of questions. This knowledge is incredibly important for exams. We try to second guess what exams are doing, but if we can train students to identify and begin to predict what might be coming up, this is going to improve their revision because they're going to look at a range of different questions. They're going to look at a range of different problems. A range of questions that have popped up that might be able to be used as scaffolds to support discussion in your class. Strategy 12 is the idea of goal-free problems. So again, it's very similar to the previous one, where students are given a set of information. They're given a brief essay, story, or mathematical task. And what we'd be asking students to do here is to work out what they can. So we wouldn't be wanting students to try to answer any set question. It is simply, here's some information from this, what do you know? It's a little bit like source interpretation, but on a grander scale with more subjects and topics. Once students have worked out what they know, they can then begin to compare and contrast this with their peers or their groups. They can explain what strategies they used, why they thought these were appropriate, and the information that they worked out. Because they're explicitly discussing the different strategies, students will be able to improve their knowledge of these different strategies and their confidence using them, and students will also become aware of the different questions that can be asked for different pieces of information. So, for example, a student might not realise that algebra can be linked into a geometry question, and if someone else is able to demonstrate this in their goal-free problem, it's starting to broaden a student's horizons to the different types of questions that they might be asked. Strategy 13 is one of my favourites. It is the odd one out. So the idea here is that you give students several words or topics or concepts, and you simply say to them, which is the odd one out. You will find, though, that there are very often very many different answers, and it's this which builds a discussion. So I put up an example here of Manchester City, Liverpool, and Manchester United. So you'd ask students here, what is the odd one out? There's several possible answers, and they would discuss and argue and debate. Possibly some of them would be wrong, or possibly sometimes students would need to convince other students why it is a possibility. So in my example here, you could obviously say that Liverpool are the odd one out because they're the only good team out of those three. The other two are absolute rubbish. You could also say they're not in Manchester if we're looking from a geographical point of view. And we could also say that really there's only one of those teams who are going to win the Premiership this year. The next strategy, strategy 14, find someone who. This is quite good if you do want to get your students up on their feet, or you've got quite an active class who work quite well if they're sort of moving around a class that you can trust to do this. You would task the students with finding another student who knows something. From a metacognition point of view, though, you could task a student with finding another student who's used a certain type of strategy. So maybe they've used a certain type of strategy to plan, a certain type of strategy to evaluate, a certain type of scaffold. It's an adaptation really of a common icebreaker activity. It's something we've probably all done and all made other people do, whether in our adult life or whether as teachers. And what we'd be looking for students to do is then discuss, once they found this individual, once they found someone with a different strategy, they discuss, why did you use that strategy? Did you find it worked well? What did you find you struggled with? And now I've explained my strategy to you. Do you think you'd use mine, or do you think you'd still use yours? So there's a little bit of discussion that could happen there. You may be looking at maybe 3 or 4 minutes per round, and then you could change the question and students could move around again. Keeps them on their feet, keeps it lively, and can often help with engagement of students as well. Strategy 15, partially worked examples. The idea here is we give students the task and the start of the question, but you don't work it out fully. Students have to complete the task. So the reason that this is quite beneficial is because the task has already been started, it might have been started in a particular manner using a particular strategy. Students then have to recall the particular steps of that strategy and start putting them into place. Also, students have to consider what the task is, and this is going to inform the next stages in the task completion. Strategy 16 is the idea of think, pair, share. This is a very, very common questioning technique which builds into discussion. It is simply the idea that you are asking a question, you pose a question to the class, you get everybody to sit and think for 30 seconds. Remember, when we're asking a question, we kind of want to be getting to that point of awkward silence before we take any answers, because otherwise we're not giving students enough time to think. Especially if we're thinking or asking them to think a little bit deeper than normal, they're going to need a little bit more time to think about their answers. Once students have thought of an answer, they then turn to the partner and provide their answer. Their partner then provides that answer back, and they can have a little bit of a discussion about that. You can then call in some answers back to the class, or you could get students to swap partners and provide their answer and get another answer. That way, students are getting a lot of different viewpoints and having to justify their answers. Because students are justifying their answers as well, we'd hope here for a little bit of evaluation, and hopefully their answers are getting a little bit better each time, and possibly they're using the information that others have given them to help improve and adapt their answers. So strategy 17 is the idea of the problem-solving grids. These are going to be mentioned in a lot more detail in the planning CPD, which is up next. Basically, students really struggle with problem solving. They don't know how to apply their knowledge, their skills, and their strategies to a non-authentic task. So I have produced these problem-solving grids, which, like I say, will be explained more in the next CPD. And what we're wanting to do is, once students have filled them in, get students to discuss them. Does their partner agree with everything they filled in? Does their partner agree with the answers they've given for the questions? Have they missed out any content? Have they chosen the wrong strategies? Or do they have different interpretations of the task? There are a huge amount of different metacognitive questions that students could ask themselves here. You could use the question cutouts to stimulate this conversation. You could put up some questions on the board that you want to lead, or you want students to use and lead on in their discussions. So there are some example questions up there on the PowerPoint that will be able to support your practice. So here is one of these examples. They come in 2 different models. So we've got the model like this, the flow model, and we have got the Freya model. So the first model here, you can see that there aren't any key questions. These are utilizing the 4 key questions of comprehension, connection, strategies, and reflection, because we know from the research that these are the 4 important question types that students need to go through for successful problem solving. So these are all available on the planning part of the website, and both types, the flow and the Freya, are available in high, medium, and low levels of scaffolding. So you can utilize them for different groups and different students. You can even get them laminated and then get students just to write on them in whiteboard pen. Saves you printing them off hundreds of times each week. So we've finished going over the strategies, and I just want to give you a little bit of a warning. It's something that you will know. We've all tried group work, but just from a metacognitive point of view, I just thought that I'd go over this again. If I've given you 17 strategies on discussion, I feel like it's only fair for me to cover a few things that we could do to support group work and discussion in our classes. So obviously group work, which is what discussion is difficult at the best of times, even with the best of classes. If Love Island was thrilling last night, that's what they're talking about. The other thing is group work gets more difficult to do when the topic and the content is more difficult. How often do we give students something that we think they're going to get on with well, or we have a class who typically work well, but then we give them something complicated and they just go off on total tangents? This is typically because the work is hard to access. It is extremely true of metacognition, which is probably going to be a little bit harder for students. This is why I've mentioned throughout the available scaffolds that we can use, such as the different models, the matrix, and the key question cards. It's especially helpful, obviously, if you've got them cut out and laminated, because then if you identify that students are struggling, you can just give them out quickly. So obviously group work has huge benefits. We've got to remember this, and this is why it's so important to try. Firstly, we can generate multiple ideas. We've identified that the more ideas and the more strategies we have got as an individual, the better chances we have got at improving our metacognitive ability. Metacognition is all about strategy and content evaluation. The more we've got to evaluate, the better choices we can make. Secondly, we can elaborate a little bit further. Like I mentioned right at the beginning, modelling and questioning are great, but this provides students with the biggest opportunity to elaborate on their answers and answer as many questions as possible. It also allows students to discuss until consensus. This isn't something we often get a chance to do, but we will want students to agree possibly on the best strategy. We will want them to debate, consider, and evaluate. These are all skills which will be supported through discussion. And obviously, like just mentioned, students will be getting through a greater volume of questioning. The next thing is similar to the consensus. In terms of those soft skills, we're going to develop some level of mutual reasoning and conflict resolution. Less maybe metacognitive, but obviously crucial skills that we're wanting students to be able to learn. However, obviously, there are the difficulties. So just in terms of how to structure this, use your knowledge of content and especially your students to select the right discussion teams. You're going to want to be thinking about ability levels, because you're probably not going to want to just put a high ability with low ability, thinking that the high ability will drag them along. You're probably going to find that the low ability need those scaffolds and the high ability maybe is just bored and does nothing, or they are just answering everything. So you're going to need to think about that carefully. You're also going to have to think about how you know students work in groups, and also if they've got any personal issues with each other and things like that. I always find it's very helpful for students to define the rules that they will follow. So if you're going to have these discussions in this group work, get students to decide on the rules that they are going to follow. If students are setting the rules, it's very easy to say, hang on, but you all agreed on this rule, but you're not following it. Sometimes students don't feel that schools are fair because they haven't chosen them, but if students have chosen these rules and agreed on them, they cannot then come back and say they're not fair. So it just gives you slightly more authority over the situation. And then obviously linking into this, providing very clear expectations. It's very, very easy for students to sort of push these boundaries. But if we're setting clear expectation, I often say for students, if we're too loud and I've got to stop you even a second time, we come back from this discussion and we stop. Typically, this will be quite powerful because students want to have these discussions. It breaks up the monotony that they can often face in lessons of sitting there in silence for 60 minutes copying and completing work. So if we do have sanctions like this, often students will want to come back into line so they can keep going with the task. And then obviously we're going to need to include those scaffolds, especially for this deeper and higher order thinking. Students are going to need more support. Utilize the scaffolds available or any other scaffolds you've got, such as knowledge organisers, to make sure that students actually have the ability to engage with this questioning and discussion. So thank you for watching this CPD. As mentioned, all of the CPD and the resources are available on our website. Please go and check out the rest of them. In a minute, I will tell you which is the next CPD in this course. More is being added all the time, so please keep going back to check, especially if there's something that you need. If you ever find that there is something you need, please feel free to drop us a message at MetacognitionU on Twitter or via the contact page on our website. The other thing is all of these resources are free. That is so that everybody can benefit from them and nobody is going to be stopped from accessing them, students or teachers, and also a school that doesn't have the budget for CPD. I want schools to be able to access it. This isn't for me to make money. However, if you do have some money left in your school budget or a few pennies and pounds as an individual you can put towards the running costs of the website, I would hugely appreciate this. I want to be able to keep the running costs down so that I can keep it free and accessible for all. The other thing is, please share this widely. Please pass it on to SLT, your teaching and learning coordinators, your heads of faculty, and other teachers within your social networks. I want people to benefit from this. The more people who know about it, the more accessible it is, the more that teachers will benefit, and obviously the more that students are going to end up benefiting. So the next CPD video in the course is going to be on metacognitive strategies to support student planning. So please go onto the teacher dropdown and click on planning, and at the top of that page you will find the CPD video on planning. I hope that this video was a help for you. If you do have any questions or queries, do feel free to get in touch, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the CPD in this course. Thank you very much.